Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this morning's session as part of PID Awareness Week, which will be focusing on the benefits of reporting wrongdoing. We're here today on Gadigal land, and I'd like to pay my respects and acknowledge the elders past and present, but also the younger generation of First Nations peoples who are the elders of the future. Before I introduce our guest today, just a little bit of housekeeping. As we move through the session today, you'll see the Q&A function at the top of your screen. So as you're moving through, if you see any questions that you'd like, or if there's any questions you'd like to put to the panel, please feel free to send them through and we'll get to as many of them as we can today. If there's any shorter questions, some of our staff might answer those for you in the chat. All right. Our guest today is Lewis Rangat, who's the Executive Director of Corruption Prevention at the ICAC. Lewis started his corruption prevention career at the Commission in 2003 as a Senior Corruption Prevention Officer and Principal Officer. He's then held various senior corruption prevention roles in the public and the private sectors before he returned to the Commission and went into his current position in May 2017. Lewis is also a certified fraud examiner. What we might do first is I will hand over to Lewis to make a couple of opening remarks around some of the benefits of reporting wrongdoing, and then we'll jump into some of the questions that hopefully come through. If you want to wait a little while, give us a chance to cover anything first before you send through questions. That would be great. But we encourage people to please send through those questions so we can have a good discussion today. Lewis, over to you.
Hi Tom, thanks for having me as part of the PID Awareness Week. It's a really important event. It's especially important for us at the ICAC because complaints, and many of those complaints are PIDs as well, they are the fuel that sort of runs our little office over there in Elizabeth Street. So without people spotting red flags or seizing the opportunity to tell us what they see or tell their management what they see, we really can't do our job properly. So it's a crucial part of our work. You mentioned that I was a certified fraud examiner, and that's part of a body called the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, the ACFE, which is an American body. They cough up some statistics from time to time. They're very difficult to get your mind around, things like corruption and collusive activities like that. But one of their regular surveys always finds that what they call tip-offs is the most frequent way that fraud is uncovered. And so their most recent survey found that of all the frauds that form part of their study, 43% came from tip-offs, and of course that's a global study and it would include some Australian data, but that figure sounds about right to us. And so it's by far and away the main channel that agencies like mine and yours find out about things like serious corrupt conduct and serious maladministration. So just imagine if that tap was turned off, how much misconduct would just remain hidden. So it's a really important statistic, and I think in some ways this metaphor of using these complaints to deal with your own dirty laundry is, in some ways, it's a bit of a forced metaphor, but it's kind of apt. So these things are happening, whether they're reported or not. But if you can get them reported and get the matters and the facts into the hands of a complaint handler, you get a good chance to sort of clean your laundry, and that's completely in the taxpayer's interest. So I think the main benefit for any public official who's tuned in today is it's really part of your duty when you see these emblems of suspicion, as the lawyers like to call them sometimes, is to speak up. And you don't have to necessarily level an allegation against someone. You don't have to use the word corruption or fraud or serious maladministration. You really just need to sort of say what you know, say what you've heard. And I think that's a nervous moment for a lot of complainants. They feel like they are dobbing, and you can tell us what you know without using some of these highly charged words. I can tell you a quick story. I had a conversation recently with one of our complainants, and she'd called wanting to just tell us what she'd been made aware of, and it was a really interesting conversation. She was not emotional at all about it. She was just doing her duty as a public servant. She called me, wanted to say that she'd seen this and this, wanted to bring it to our attention, wasn't interested in being involved in the case, was just doing her duty and passing on the information. In some ways, that's the best kind of complainant, someone that's not emotionally involved in the matter. They're just doing their duty, passing on their information to the person who can do something with it. And I suppose the counterpoint is that the opposite kind of person is also a really good kind of complaint. Someone who's completely emotionally invested in their matter. So sometimes they struggle to be objective about it. Sometimes they're highly motivated complainant. They might be the victim, and sometimes they might even have it in for the person they're complaining about. But they're very cooperative, those types of complainants. They'll do everything they can to provide you with as much possible information as they can. So we deal with both, the emotionally detached and the completely invested, and they both make a good kind of complainant if you're a good complaint handler. And I suppose that's one interesting thing worth touching on is the new Act, as you know very well, there's this new official reporting channel. You can report matters to your manager, your line manager. It's really important reform as part of the new Act. And again, going back to the ACFE, that global data says that most complainants, and again this is in the world of fraud, as part of a global survey, their preferred channel is their manager. Yep. That's their preferred channel. It's not the only channel, but adding that to the mix with the new Act is really important. So normally you have some sort of hopefully some sort of trusting relationship with your manager, and you might not have any sort of relationship with the governance people or the legal people in head office. In large organisations, you don't have any sort of relationship with the head of the agency, so someone that you can bounce the ideas off that's close to you is really important. The other little story I wanted to tell was a job we did, we finished not too long ago, called Operation Hector. That's an interesting story. My boss, the Chief Commissioner, John Hatzistikos, is coming in tomorrow. He might talk a little bit more about Operation Hector. This is a matter that started with a complaint at Inner West Council, and from memory it was an anonymous complaint, and certainly the complainant's named not in our report because it doesn't need to be, and that's the law. Saw something that looked a bit odd about some procurement matters and spoke up inside Inner West Council. And some of the governance folks in that council they kind of worked the job up. And this is, I suppose, one of the missing links in all of this. If you get the matter into the hands of a sort of qualified, experienced complaint handler, that gives you the best sort of chance of getting the job moving. And so they did a good little preliminary investigation, had a look at some of their own data, some of their procurement data, and worked it up to the point where they could report it to us. And all of the folks joining us today on the call will know that under Section 11 of our Act, it's mandatory to report reasonably suspected corruption if you're a head of an agency through to the ICAC. So we've got the Section 11 report that came to us from Inner West Council, and now if you go and read the ICAC report on Operation Hector, we were able to then take the report and start looking at some other matters using our powers, and that led to the job involving not only Inner West Council but Transport for New South Wales. So someone out there has done the right thing, picked up the phone or sent some intel across to the governance folks at Inner West Council, and that led to us uncovering quite a lot of serious corrupt conduct that spread to another agency. So if we don't get that call, we can't do that work. We're not telepathic. So it's really good example of someone doing the right thing, some governance staff turning into a job, and us using our powers to sort of finish off the job. So there's sort of quite good stories to seize on. So I think the other point worth touching on is, you and I probably, when we're out there talking to folks, Tom, is people will often say to us, is the Act working? There's never been a conviction. Surely the Act isn't working, but I think that's not quite the right way to think about it. So you often hear horror stories about whistleblowers being treated poorly, and I've just come back from a conference up in Darwin. We were talking about the Australian Public Sector Anti-Corruption Conference, and pretty much every conference you go to, there's someone on the program who's a whistleblower who's had a bad experience. It's a standard thing you see on a fraud or corruption conference. And of course, I met a whistleblower up there from Queensland, and she was telling her horrendous story about being treated badly. But what you don't hear about is all of the success stories. They just don't rate a mention in the press. So things like the Operation Hector job, all of the jobs that your team does, my colleagues do, where the complaint comes in, the information is passed on, we get a successful outcome, and sometimes that's an adverse find, but sometimes it's the subject of the complaint is cleared. They're both successful outcomes. our complaints handlers all across New South Wales, they have a lot of successes, and they never make the front page of the newspaper. They never get mentioned at a conference. They never get mentioned at some sort of royal commission. And there's hundreds of those. The case is solved, the disclosure is protected, or their name is never released. And I think that evidence that you and I see and our colleagues see is telling us that the Act is really working quite well, and so it's a good outcome. Maybe just one or two other quick comments before we move on. The work that we do at the Commission, obviously we're tackling corruption, and you guys specialise in the maladministration, the serious maladministration. The difference between the two really in a lot of ways is the mental element, what's going on in the mind of the wrongdoer. And so for it to be corrupt conduct, you need this idea of a corrupt motive or a corrupt mindset. And once you're working with this corrupt mindset, you really are probably taking active steps to cover your tracks or collude. And so that once you get into that brand, that species of wrongdoing, it's even more important because the parties to the transaction, the corrupt behaviour, aren't going to speak up. They're part of it. Another thing that corrupt people do that we tend to find is, of course, some of them make terrible mistakes and they get caught straight away. They sort of don't think it through. But your typical corrupt person will put a fair bit of planning into their work. So they understand the controls in their agency. They'll understand how audit behaves. They'll understand how their manager behaves. And so they'll plan to defeat all of those controls and trick their manager. And of course, very, very successful corrupt actors will get away with it to a significant extent. We know we don't catch all of it. But what's very hard for a corrupt person to do is to eliminate all of the red flags of their behaviour. And so they always take a little bit of a gamble when they're carrying out their corrupt plans, and they have to leave some sort of a little trail usually. And we just hope that someone out there sees enough of that to be seized of the issue so that they'll pick up the phone or fill in the web form or whatever it is. And so that's why that's sort of the number one sort of reporting channel. So I might just wrap up my comments there. Maybe I'll just make one final observation. It's funny, if you go into the annual reports that the Ombudsman release, you see these stats about what these complaints are about. Most of them are about corrupt conduct, which is really a bit of a paradox because in our work we know that there's more maladministration in the public sector than there is corrupt conduct. In some ways, corruption is a subspecies of maladministration. And it's odd that a lot of the complaints more of the complaints are about corrupt conduct. I think in some ways it's the type of misconduct that irritates people the most. But I think there is some work to be done around raising awareness around the serious maladministration. That can be just as damaging to the public interest, and because there's overlap between these two types of misconduct, I know our two officers who work very closely together, but I think there's a good opportunity for agencies to get a bit better at taking the information they have in the workplace and identifying those as PIDs about serious maladministration, doing things about those, and that's another good example of sort of working in the public interest. So it doesn't have to be all about corrupt conduct.
I think, thank you so much, but I think building on that too, it's one of the advantages to the wording of the new Act is that there is that easy opportunity. I mean, our two officers do refer matters quite regularly under our overarching acts, but there is that opportunity too for integrity agencies when something comes in the door that may not be, in some cases there might be a corruption element, that there's also that serious maladministration, for that to be referred quickly and easily across so that it can be picked up by the relevant body as well. Yeah. So I think that's one of the huge advantages. One thing I wanted to pick up on is you made that excellent point about the fact that people are quite often happiest going to their managers, but also about the important outcomes that can come from those reports. I think it's interesting to link that international research back through to the Audit Office's 2016 fraud survey results, where they showed that tip-offs were far and away the most effective method that they had of identifying fraud within public sector agencies. So I think that shows that internal information, and it's the point you made, that those red flags are always there, and the person who's most likely to see them and have some concerns is someone that's working alongside the person involved.
That's right. And the other slow-moving trend we're seeing is that more and more agencies and companies are getting better at looking at their own data. And we've seen with some controversies around automated decision-making that often you still need a human in the loop to look at the data. So you might run some tests on your data, or your vendor master file, your payroll, whatever it is, and you get a report that says you've got 10 red flags. And the human being needs to look at those 10 red flags and find the one that's worth acting on. And so that person who's doing that work also becomes a very important cog in the wheel. And so you need to have good intelligence around when you see that red flag, does it go to the manager, does it go to legal, does it go to the Ombudsman? So that's another sort of element that's slowly emerging as robots gradually take over the world and take over our jobs. So that's going to be something we all need to keep an eye on.
Yeah. And I think that catches to one of the other good amendments that came through with the new legislation, which is classing those different categories of disclosure differently. So, you've got those ones when you think of Section 11, but other internal auditors are the ones that always spring to mind for me. If it's part of your core work, then identifying those as mandatory public interest disclosures means that they can move through. The person who's made it still attracts the protections of the Act if they need it, but they don't necessarily move through those same requirements under Part 5 of the Act around what information needs to be provided. Whereas someone who does come forward and make a voluntary public interest disclosure may not have that same support behind, which allows them to know what's happening, know what's going to happen next, and know that that's a day-to-day part of their work.
Oh, for sure. But it is worth pointing out that folks in those mandatory roles, someone like a head of internal audit or even the head of an agency, they can still be pretty brutalised by. So I've had plenty of conversations over my career with heads of audit who are they feel this duty to report what they've spotted or what they've been told, and they're put under pressure by management to, if not cover it up completely, but minimise it. Let's just keep this in-house. Yeah. We don't need ICAC finding out about this. And so we hear a lot of bit of behind the scenes unofficial chatter about agencies just trying to minimise the material that they want to send through to us. And again, in some ways, it's a natural response to try and hope for the best and not the worst. But everyone involved in the loop needs that protection. And I think even very senior people who might be working to a minister or under pressure from the media, there's all sorts of peculiar reasons why people sometimes it's a bit slow to give that frank and fearless account of what's been brought to their attention.
You spoke about the day-to-day work for the Commission, and I know it's true of our office as well. Do you see public interest disclosures in their various forms as being one of the core sources of information that the Commission has in order to inform its work and to undertake those very important investigations that it does do?
Definitely, it's the number one source. So we'll take complaints from non-public officials, and we've had some great jobs emerge from those. But our number one source of information are insiders who know what's going on, which are public officials under the PID Act. And second place is a long way back. We are getting better at using strategic intelligence to work up jobs, and we get some jobs from law enforcement, but that is easily the number one way. And you can imagine a typical complaint. Again, if it's something about corruption, a collusive activity, no one really brings a case to you that's tied up in a bow. They'll give you fragments of information. So they might say, I've spotted something, I overheard this conversation, I've done this Google search, and here's what I know. And so you get these jobs that are all in the grey zone. You can't investigate all of them. And so you have to have this sort of talent as an assessments officer or a complaint handler to know which ones have got some legs to them, which ones might have a bit of ring of truth about them. And it's a bit one of these things, it's a mix between an art and a skill. And obviously you're adding information from other sources that you have, and people making astute decisions along the way there, it's crucial to getting a good outcome.
And I think that's one of the challenges too, is sometimes people only have that small part of the picture, but it's important to recognise, and that is that test under the PID Act, that if they've got that honest belief and there's a reasonable grounds for them to have reached that position, then that does fall within the scope of the Act. So even if they have a small picture of the window, through the window, that's still enough for them to come in under the Act.
That's all you need. If the test was you will only act on the case if you've already solved the case, it's a contradiction in terms then, so it has to operate that way. Yep. And of course it's a point where organisations like ours and law enforcement have to step in, and it's only organisations like those that can access bank accounts and use some of those coercive powers. But it's also important that we don't just switch on those powers lightly. So we have to have a reasonable basis for using some of those coercive powers, and again we rely on the complainants to give us the fuel for the use of those powers.
When those matters do move through to investigation, I think one of the things that a lot of people are curious about, and one of the concerns they may have, is how those protections operate in practice. Can you talk a little bit about how the Commission provides that protection and support to someone who has come forward and provided information?
Yes, there's a little known, less well known amendment that came through with the PID Act. There was a new Part 8A inserted into the ICAC Act, and the ICAC Act has always had provisions in there criminalising people who obstruct our investigations. But what has now happened is, essentially what's happened, the objects of the PID Act now also are replicated in the ICAC Act. And what that means is that anyone who's assisting us with our inquiries, as they say, so responding to one of our notices, reporting under Section 11, being a witness in any way, shape or form, they have basically the same protection. So that same detrimental action offence sits with that same penalty. And so really, in plain terms, that means mucking around with our witnesses attracts a criminal penalty. Now, we haven't had, that tends not to happen because people, I wouldn't say they're afraid of the ICAC, but they know that ICAC has serious powers and will use them. So we haven't had that wasn't in response to sort of spate of mistreatment of our witnesses, but it's nice to have it there if we need it. So the offence exists there. We can work with the police and the court to take basically injunctive action and other actions to stop any potential detrimental action being taken against effectively what we call our witnesses. So that's matters that are under investigation. Also, we as I said before, we can't investigate everything. So sometimes what we do is a matter will come to us, we don't think it's serious or systemic, and we can only deal with serious or systemic under our legislation. We'll sometimes refer it to the agency. And of course we abide by the Act, so we don't disclose the identity or anything that we tend to identify the disclosure unless they've given us their written permission, which is how the Act works. So in a sense, they can make the complaint to us. We can refer it back to the agency in a sense that keeps their name well out of it. And sometimes our intuition is to refer it, but even if we think there's some chance it would identify the disclosure and they don't agree to it, even then we're on the side of caution. We don't refer it across, or we remove details that won't identify them. And so surely we're just sort of passing the matter back to the agency. But I think sometimes when it comes with an ICAC letter sitting over the top of it, and we can use powers to require agencies to report back, it just adds a little bit of extra seriousness to it. And so I think it doesn't necessarily force the agency to, but it gives them a bit more of an incentive to finish off the job. And of course, the PID Act also requires, it's not quite an obligation, but there's part of I think it's Section 55, agencies must decide how to deal with these PIDs. It's a bit more accountability about not just dropping these matters. Yep. So if you get one that comes from us, it's a little bit of an extra oomph to deal with it, to see it through to the end. Mm.
For those matters that you do refer back, how do you look at the risk of detrimental action before that referral? And also, do you have that ongoing contact either with the agency or the person who came forward in order to track if that risk's arising or if they've got concerns around detrimental action occurring? So
it's a little bit case by case. Certainly with the complainants, we maintain contact with them, and we've got sort of standard reproducible sort of processes there. We always ask them to get back to us if they're victimised in some way, shape or form. But the main control is we just make sure that their identity or anything that tends to identify them, it doesn't get across with our referral. But sometimes things happen, and so we can loop back. But we as you know, the Act gives agencies some authority to make these referrals and identify people if there's written consent. So sometimes we'll seek that. But I think, again, I'm reluctant to use the word fear, but I think there's really, I can't even think of a case where someone's taken detrimental action knowing that we're on the scene, if I can put it that way. So it's not a bad channel to use, the ICAC channel, if that's your choice.
Yep. Thank you. One of the other amendments to the Act that really sort of closes that loop in these sort of matters when an agency is dealing with the disclosure is the requirement that if they do find that serious wrongdoing or misconduct took place, they need to take some form of corrective action. The Act does list a couple of categories that fall within that. Are you able to talk a little bit about what you've seen through your experience at the Commission around what corrective action can look like?
Yeah, that's right. So most of our investigation reports contain a corruption prevention chapter at the end. And so the types of things we put into that, which is parallel, sometimes we talk about some bigger reforms around laws, policies and procedures. And so I think it's a standard thing if you've had a lapse or even a near miss. I know the Act doesn't talk about near misses, but it only talks about a sort of a substantiated example of wrongdoing. But you should do it for near misses as well. So you're sort of looking at a hierarchy of laws, policies, procedures, and then you're sort of looking at things like were people properly trained in their responsibilities, were the policies and procedures easy to follow, and then you sometimes get down to the level of individual controls. So there's a kind of a standard kit bag of corruption prevention controls around things like IT permissions, segregations of duties, some of those things that craft a person's discretion. And often a corruption event is a misuse of discretion. So your standard playbook is you look at how is discretion misused, is it a sensible thing to do to reel in that person's discretion. Sometimes you don't, but it's a good place to look. And obviously normally on the back of a hit or a near miss, a little burst of refresher training isn't a bad thing. And one reason for that is, thankfully, corruption is relatively rare in New South Wales. We're quite fortunate. But you don't want to waste an emergency. So if there has been an incident, people are normally seized of the issue, their antennae are up, and you can use that as a example of a highly salient issue, just to do some training around, well, this happened. Sure, we're not happy that it happened, but this is how we sort of correct it. This is how we stop it from happening again. So some post-event awareness raising is usually a good idea.
I think with your experience, you'd be well placed to talk to this. But one of the objects of the Act now is to create that, for want of a better term, speak up culture across the public sector. It's a little bit less cut and dried than some of your other legislative provisions. But how do you see, and you've had that experience over the years, how do you see those sort of effective culture changes operating? There are particular levers that you pull. Is there the right sort of messaging? Is it day-to-day interactions, or is there anything else that feeds in there as well?
These culture issues are so they're not tricky, but they're very organic things, aren't they? Yep. And so you can easily point to a bad culture when you see it, and then everyone says, let's do a culture change initiative, and that's the really hard work. And so you're really just you have to change the way people think and the way they behave. And so sometimes this is done with a big bang effect, yep. And so you bung on a Royal Commission, or the best example really in recent history is the Police Royal Commission from the mid-90s. It was this big bang effect, clean the place out, high degree of exposure, and that really that's created lasting reform. The police force in New South Wales is very clean compared to that pre-Royal Commission. That's a successful reform, and I suppose the opposite way to do is just to chip away, and so that's a program of multifaceted, removing people who aren't living the correct culture, hiring people who do, fixing up the policies and procedures. It's lots of chipping away, and it's a lot of this, tone at the top that everyone talks about, but it's hard to really itemise what that looks like. I think one little tip around this tone at the top is you often hear this distinction between a high-performing culture and an honest culture. In some ways, you have to make a bit of a choice between the two. And what I mean by that is, if you want an honest culture, you have to have a degree of tolerance, I think, for honest mistakes. Yep. No tolerance for dishonesty, but if you're going to have it that way, you have to have a little bit of tolerance for honest mistakes, because you want people to come forward and say, oh, sorry, Tom, I stuffed this up. I'm not corrupt. I made this mistake. And so that's the type of culture you want, people coming forward, admitting their mistakes. If people have been dishonest, they won't come forward and admit that very often. And that's a little bit of a seesaw between those two. Getting those things right, and the formal and informal targets and KPIs that senior managers work to is usually part of the equation as well.
Fantastic, thank you. It is interesting looking at those sort of levers that you can pull within an organisation to bring about that sort of change, and I think that's one of the real challenges, and certainly a call out to I know we've got a lot of PID practitioners who've come in for this session and for the sessions throughout the week. I don't think it just sits with organisations like ours. In fact, I think probably the benefit comes from agency staff talking that message within their organisation and linking it back to, the importance of coming forward and speaking up when you see something wrong. And it might be, I mean, you mentioned that mistake. It might just be, yes, I've made a mistake, and then the organisation going, okay, how do we fix it? Yeah. Which then means you don't necessarily progress to the next stage of going, oh, well, if I make a mistake next time, I'll be quiet, and there might be another element to it as well. Yeah,
that's right. And of course, that's not to say that if someone makes 12 mistakes in a row, you don't deal with that, but there's a balance. Yeah. There's a balance, yeah.
Absolutely. Look, great. Thank you so much. I was hoping that we'd have the ability to have some questions coming through, but I have a feeling that the technical gremlins might have got in the way of us today for questions from the floor. I would say to everyone who's come along today, if you're still tuned in, I apologise if we've had some issues early on. Hopefully we'll have a complete video content that'll be coming up. We'll have that up on our website as soon as possible. And if you did have questions for us, please feel free to send them through to our office, and I'm sure we can work with Lewis to get some questions and answers out to people as soon as possible. So with that said, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to continuing to work together as two officers to help to improve the speak up culture across the public sector.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of the week.
Yeah, thanks, Lewis. Thanks, everyone.